I want to thank all of you for coming out for tonight's Reading the World Conversation Series event featuring award-winning author Jorge Volpi and his translator Alfred McAdam. I'm Chad Post, the director of Open Letter Books, which recently published Jorge's Season of Ash, which is beautiful and right here and in the back. And the press, Open Letter, in case you don't know, specializes in all literature and translation, doing 10 to 12 books a year from all over the world. And before I introduce our esteemed guest, I just want to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the Rare Books and Special Collections Library for making this event possible, or in fact, for making the whole reading series possible. We wouldn't be able to have this if it wasn't thanks to both of them. I also want to give special thanks to the National Endowment for the Arts and to the New York State Council on the Arts for helping underwrite this whole year's series of events. We've already had one event, which was with Charlotte Mandel, the translator of this book we're publishing next year, Zone, which took place like a week or two ago and is available on our website if you guys want to check it out. We are going to have one more event in the fall part of the Reading the World Conversation series, which is going to take place on Thursday, November 5th. And it's a special event featuring 4 different authors that are in residence at the Ledig House for international writers. So keep that in mind. But tonight we're here to hear from Jorge and Alfred. I'll start by introducing Alfred, who's one of the preeminent Latin American translators of our times. In addition to translating Jorge's book, he's translated works from some of the greatest writers of the 20th century, including Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, Jose Donoso, Alejo Carpentier, Juan Carlos Onetti, who's one of my favorites, and Julio Cortázar, another favorite. He's also a professor of Latin American literature at Barnard College and Columbia University, and the author of 3 books, the most recent of which is Textual Confrontations, Essays in the Comparative Study of Latin American Literature. It's also worth noting that for 20 years, he was the editor of Review, Latin American Literature and the Arts, a publication of the American Society. And I want to thank him for taking time out of his really busy, hectic teaching schedule to fly up here suddenly to have a one-night event with us. Now, in terms of Jorge, I first heard of Jorge actually in this magazine Criticas that is no longer in existence really, back in the early 2000s. It was a special magazine that was part of Publishers Weekly and was devoted to promoting Latin American and Spanish literature. And in this one particular issue, there's a review of this book called In Search of Klingsorr, which I have actually right here, which was described as a thriller, a puzzle, and a witty intellectual game, and had received all these heaps of praise, including from people such as Carlos Fuentes, who said that Jorge will, quote, be one of the stars of Spanish literature of this century, which sounded pretty amazing. But within this review, the thing that most caught my attention was actually the fact that Jorge was one of the founding members of the crack movement, a collection of 5 young Mexican writers determined to go beyond or to break, which is where the crack comes from, with the second wave of magical realism that had come to dominate the landscape of Latin American literature, and especially those few works that were being translated at the time, which is an issue you guys might end up talking about, I kind of hope, because there was a period when nothing, you couldn't get translated from Spanish unless you were writing this sort of magical realism in which toasters flew and iguanas gave wise advice and whatnot. Now, when I first heard about this, I really wanted to find this crack manifesto, which is an incredibly difficult thing to find on Google. I instead found a lot about drugs and about different ways in which you can get yourself off of crack. But then a few years later, we did find and publish a translated version of this in Context Magazine. So if you go to Open Letter's website, openletterbooks.org, and visit his book, you'll be able to link off to the English translation of the manifesto, or it's on the 3% website, which is www.rochester.edu/3%, all spelled out with no spaces or anything. Now, the manifesto is made up of 5 short pieces from the core crack members, each articulating his aesthetics in a slightly different way, but all hitting upon the idea of having to discard the immediate past and return to a type of literary experience that is more complex and rewarding than reading books that contain those elements I talked about, like the toasters bit. Now, another thing that comes up in the manifesto is the desire to write worldly cosmopolitan novels, works that are set outside of Mexico, works that are about historical events that may not have taken place in Mexico, works that are very similar to Season of Ash, which spans the last part of the 20th century, starting with the catastrophe of Chernobyl, ending with the Genome Project, and spanning the fall of the Berlin Wall, the influence of the International Monetary Fund on developing economies, and the impact science and big ideas had on our personal lives, or in this case of this novel, on the lives of 5 specific women. Now, of course, Season of Ash is a novel of ideas, but it's also kind of a detective novel, and most importantly, a true page-turner in the best sense of the word. And once you pick this up, I guarantee you guys will just read it straight through. And speaking of the book and picking it up, copies are available for sale in the back. And in fact, we're having a special sale to celebrate the Reading the World Conversation series, in which you can all buy 2 books for the low, heavily discounted price of $22. So you get Jorge's book and one more for only $22. And if you don't want to do that tonight, it's available until until November 15th. So you have, whatever, 22 more days to take advantage.
You can afford not to.
Yeah, you can afford not to. And in fact, as an added bonus for this special event, and once you buy the 2 books for $22, your name is entered into a drawing to win a free subscription to Open Letter for 1 year. So, see, extra. Anyways, without any more stuff for me, I'm going to turn the mic over to Jorge to read a bit of Season of Ash. So let's welcome that.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much for being here. I'm really excited about being here at the University of Rochester. Thank you very much to Chad, to the university, and of course to Alfred McCann, responsible of this wonderful translation. I'm going to read one of the last chapters of the book. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you who's the murderer. It's a chapter called Requiem. It's about a young Russian girl, a teenager. She was born at the time of the Soviet Union. She's the daughter of 2 biologists and dissidents of the Soviet Union, but she doesn't understand the world at the time of the Soviet Union, and she doesn't understand the world either when the Soviet communism fell. So at one moment she decides to go to Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. So I'm going to read this chapter. You have to forget my heavy Spanish accent and to imagine that it's a Russian accent. Vladivostok, Russian Federation, the year is 2000. It's not me. It's some other girl who's suffering, Oksana told herself when she opened her eyes. Down spread over her, turbid and milky, much like the ocean that was devouring the port. She rubbed her eyes until she hurt herself. Only pain allowed her to withstand the moonlight that filtered through the window. One more day, she muttered. They took you away at dawn. She then prayed and imagined herself transformed into an ice floe, an iceberg. Finally, she got up. That place did not belong to the world. It was the vestibule to hell, a cold and stormy hell. She walked a few steps and turned on the lights. Nothing. This was the worst time of the year. In midwinter, her neighborhood only had electricity and heat 3 or 4 hours a day, and the temperature barely got above 0. She couldn't understand how the old people of Vladivostok, the ghost port, didn't freeze to death in their houses. What insane strength, the Russian soul, kept them from dying in winter. Oksana bundled herself up, walked to the kitchen, and turned on the gas, running the risk that she might be using her last bit of gas. The tea seared her throat. Death is bleeding over our heads, she said to herself. She sat down at the desk, a bouquet of dry carnations on the end, a postcard from Anushka in the center, the rest covered with pieces of paper of different colors and sizes, all filthy or covered with drafts. She grasped her pencil as if it were a dagger. She could spend the entire morning like that, her mind a blank, numb, a buoy in the middle of the ocean, not noticing the hours that passed. She lit a pair of candles, the only glow allowed her clench her teeth and tried not to think about the Korean, to keep his memory, his rancid smell, his pallor, his indifference from distracting her from her music. After 2 hours of cold, her fingers finally stretched out a few lines. If it rhymes with blood, it poisons the blood, and it's the bloodiest thing in the world. Nothing truer or more precise. She looked at her scar-covered arms.